Okay. So, good evening, everybody. I wanted to sort of share with you a little bit about what we've been doing from a Cadbury perspective on cocoa, and just to sort of drill into some of the challenges that we've faced when doing that and why we've gone about looking at cocoa in the way that we have. First of all, though, a bit of an introduction to Cadbury, because hopefully you all know Cadbury. For those of you who are staying around for drinks afterwards, I have brought chocolate, so thank you. But Cadbury is one of the largest confectionery companies in the world. We have businesses as far afield as Alaska to Argentina and the Americas, throughout Europe, down to the southern tip of Africa, all the way through Asia and down to Australia and New Zealand. And depending on where you go in the world, people think that Cadbury started there or it started in Bourneville now. If you go to Australia, it started in Australia. If you go to India, it started in India. And in fact, you know, it's so close to the sort of psyche of how cocoa farming works in parts of the world. If you go to India, the cocoa tree is the Cadbury tree, quite literally. When we started to think about where cocoa and long-term sustainability came from, it became increasingly clear to us the number of challenges we had to tackle. And one of those things was about how we look forward for the next 10, 20, 30 years and look at what the supply chains that Cadbury as a business is dependent upon. And cocoa is the most significant of those. And sustainable long-term supply chains is one of our 6 core business sustainability commitments. They run alongside sustainable consumption, so bear that in mind as you share your chocolate bars afterwards, in case there's anybody from the Department of Health here. And then alongside that, it's questions of quality and safety, how we look at the environment and climate change in particular, how we work with communities and how we work with our colleagues around the world. Most important, though, about all of those 6 things is they are embedded within day-to-day business strategy. I haven't brought it along with me, but we have a slide that I could have shown that sort of shows you how our 3 core business goals are underpinned by those 6 sustainability pillars of activity. And what we've tried to do over the last 2 or 3 years is shift the emphasis and shift the balance really from CSR as something that might sit peripherally within a business, something outside of those core business activities, into something that actually is about sustainable business in itself, in its own right, something that underpins day-to-day business activity. Because it's my belief that unless you do that, actually, particularly when we're going through the sort of economic challenges that we all face today, it's very easy for things that might have been philanthropic in nature to get pushed off the agenda. And actually, the decision we took when we started to think about cocoa was that we couldn't afford that to happen, for some of the reasons I'll share with you today. These were some of our inspirations into why we should change differently. The most important one is actually number 2 on that list. We did a big piece of research work on value chains in cocoa farming. Did it with IDS out of Sussex and also the University of Ghana. And we looked very closely at what are the drivers for cocoa farmers, their families, their communities within Ghana and elsewhere. And in particular, how does that play out against policy frameworks that might exist or might be being generated? Where does the development agenda sit to that? How does trade sit with that? What are the things that means farmers who ostensibly have been given a lot more cocoa knowledge over the last few years and for a long time as far as Ghana is concerned, what are the things that are stopping those farmers improving their livelihoods? That came on the back, and I'll talk about some of the outputs of that in a moment as you start to see the program that we've developed. That came on the back of lots of other activity that was going on the ground, much of which we were doing ourselves, so you know, things like farmers' newspapers to try and spread the word about how you grow cocoa in a more productive way, in a more environmentally sustainable way, in a way that maintains the quality that underpins the chocolate that we make here in the UK. Educational initiatives, working with things like microfinance people to get communities moving in a slightly different way. But the way I would characterise it is there's a lot of policy ideas up here and there's a lot of great grassroots activity down there, but there's a huge gap in the middle. And actually that gap is the gap that talks to scale. And if we can start to think about how we fill that, then we might have a slightly different perspective on how we develop and manage supply chains as a business going forward, and actually how maybe development and business works in the future. There were other things that were happening, results around the whole challenge around worst forms of child labour that you'll all be aware of in the cocoa sector, results from certification research around those and the criteria around that, and then the questions, and not just the questions, but the different ways of working that groups like the Fair Trade movement were raising, the NGOs were raising, and they started to help us think slightly differently. And I think the other catalyst, strange as it may seem, is it's 101 years this year since Cadbury first went into Ghana. And ironically, Cadbury went to Ghana to source cocoa from Ghana, then because of concerns over labour standards in Sao Tome, where most of the cocoa for the UK was sourced then. And so, we've almost gone sort of somewhat full circle here and started to think differently about how we have to look for the next 100 years. Because inevitably, when you get to that sort of milestone, you sort of look back and say, well, OK, what's happened? What have we done? What have we changed? What's been good? What's been less good? What's even been bad at times? And how do we look to the next 100 years? And I have to say that was part of the thinking in terms of how do we take the historic values of the Cadbury brothers, who once said business could be a force for good in a troubled world, into a modern context. And certainly talking to our board and our chief executive, the legacy that they want to leave fits within the view of the next 100 years. This is what we decided in the end to do. We looked at cocoa, we thought long and hard about how we might manage those issues, and we decided that the right way forwards was to try and change the scale and the pace of our activity. And that meant a £45 million investment initially over the next 10 years. It was about long-term change, it was about long-term programmes, and that was something that was slightly different from some stuff that had been done before. And when I said before about changing the rules of the game so it isn't small-scale CSR for PR purposes perhaps, it's about long-term development and change that underpins hopefully mutual benefit within that supply chain. That was where the goal came from. We also decided that we had to take a very holistic perspective on this, that it really wasn't going to be adequate to try and tackle some of these huge challenges in isolation. I mean, frankly, anybody who sort of thinks that we're going to change the challenges around worst forms of child labour by walking around West Africa with a clipboard and saying they do, they don't, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea, frankly, it just doesn't bear thinking about. And what I hope that we started to do was to try and understand the different connections between all of the different challenges that our research posed and that other people have been very vocal about as well. What we also decided very early on was that this was something that Cadbury couldn't do on its own. We might be quite knowledgeable about cocoa, we might have a bit of experience in it, but actually Cadbury isn't a development organisation, and to Andy's point earlier, it was very much about saying who can we work with to try and create the right environment, the right sort of partnership where shared goals can start to come to pass. And that's what started to stimulate the work in the Cocoa Partnership that I'll come on to. From a business perspective, it was about our values, and community was absolutely part of that, but also the social imperative. I think we came rapidly to the conclusion that we didn't want to see cocoa as a commodity. We didn't want to stand at the end of a supply chain and just expect it to continue ad infinitum in the way that it might have done for the last 100 years. That actually the world is changing very rapidly, and that the role that we as a business had to play perhaps also had to change as well. And the relationship that we had with farmers and Ghana and our supply chain within that had to change. And that was very important in terms of looking towards what the business benefits are. And I'm quite clear about this. There are business benefits for us, just as there are business benefits for the farmers. For Cadbury, it's about having confidence in the supply chain going forward. And when some of your suppliers turn around to you and say, I actually don't want to supply you, because in 3 years' time, I want to do something totally different. That's what was starting to happen to us when we spoke to cocoa farming communities. And you speak to children in cocoa farming communities, and first of all, they definitely don't want to be farmers. And if you ask them, do you want to be cocoa farmers, they tend to burst out laughing. Now, that's not a very good confidence level for building a business for the next 20 years. And sadly, it isn't just cocoa farming communities. I think you could look at farming communities all over the world in lots of different sectors and see very, very similar things. But for us, cocoa is the biggest ingredient, the most important ingredient, and actually a really important part of the Cadbury heritage. And so looking differently about how we manage that was particularly important to us going forward. And whether it's about the quality or the quantity, actually there's a mutual benefit that we gain if the farmers gain. And a sustainable cocoa supply chain is what we're trying to set up. I say trying because it's an ongoing piece of work. This is what we call our vision interaction, which is the one-page strategic summary of what the whole project in Ghana is about. Most of this, and I say most of it, probably 95% of this, was developed with our partners in Ghana, including farmers, including NGOs, the Ghanaian government, United Nations groups, particularly UNDP, DFID from an observer perspective, a whole range of people, to try and encapsulate an action plan that says this is how we can tackle some of the challenges that we know exist and how we can create, well, more importantly, I think, from a business point of view, support a long-term sustainable supply chain that has that mutual benefit. Because, frankly, if there aren't thriving rural communities at the heart of that supply chain, then there won't be a supply chain in 20 years' time. And that was the perhaps harsh reality that we came to, and that's what persuaded our board to invest in the way it has done. What I'd like to sort of show you most of all is the sort of 4 areas of activity in the pillars on the bottom half of the page that talk to sustainable livelihoods from cocoa, which is where perhaps the business case from Cadbury and the business case from the farmers is most closely linked. But also recognising that actually it's not great for farmers to be 90 to 95% dependent on one particular crop. So additional income opportunities that come from other crops and rural enterprise, which is entirely in line with the way the Ghanaian government's development programme is shaping up, are part of the programme. It also has to support community-centred development, because education is a fundamental part of creating and supporting thriving rural communities for us, as is other forms of industry, healthcare, and the most basic stuff like potable water, something that Cadbury's had been involved in for many, many years now, and lots of water wells going in. But thinking back to sort of joining all those different pieces of activity up, this was perhaps the first time we'd drawn all those threads of things together and said, actually, these are things that we can do really well. These are things we need partners to do with us, and these are things, actually, it's still the job of other people to do. So this isn't Cadbury building lots of schools. It's Cadbury working with government to help stimulate education programmes and support things in certain ways. And that's where the last pillar for me is particularly important, the institutional engagement piece. If the policy frameworks that support this type of programme aren't in place, then frankly I'll be wasting £45 million, and that's not good for me or our business, and certainly not good for farmers. And realistically, much of the work that sits behind the scenes is about looking at these policy frameworks and trying to join the top level up with the grassroots stuff and make things work. And it's really difficult. It's questions like land tenure. It's questions about who owns the land that the farmers are using. And that's a really challenging thing to be tackling in West Africa particularly. It's also about simple politics at times. If I look at Ghana, there's a sort of bit of a political battle going on about who owns extension services for farmers, whether it's Cocoa Board, for those of you who know Ghana, or whether it's the Ministry of Agriculture, who currently own them. Now, what we know is that farmers don't get any extension services, or those that they get are suboptimal. And there's a lot of move to change that and change the dynamic. But actually, you've got to sort the political framework out first, because unless you do that, any changes just won't last. So that's the sort of broad picture. And then across the bottom, and I hope you can see it at the back, are 4 cross-cutting themes that actually have to impact on all of those. And actually, this has now been updated by our Ghana team. It doesn't just say HIV/AIDS, it says HIV/AIDS and malaria, because in Ghana, malaria is particularly an issue for us. Worst forms of child labour and trafficking, biodiversity conservation, environmental sustainability, and then gender empowerment. Because all of those things collectively will impact and help to drive thriving rural communities, not just for the next 5 years, but the next 25 years. So we have to try and build those in. Now, this makes a very challenging agenda for us, and it's not easy, which is why we're hoping that the partnership will pull the different skills in together. And certainly working with NGOs, people like CARE, World Vision, VSO, has been incredibly valuable for us in reaching communities and finding different ways to work with those communities. And frankly, the partnership is solely dependent on the value that other people bring to it. It really is an effort in trying to create a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. I shall stop quickly then. I thought if I don't put this slide up, somebody will shout at me. But for me, fair trade is absolutely part of this conversation. It isn't the whole answer, but it's very much a case of shared values and shared direction. And what I think it actually does is build some of the links that we see from the producer market to the consumer market very effectively. It is very much about a shared approach in terms of community organisation, farmer engagement, farmer interaction, and helping those farmers to long-term sustainable goals. But I sit it alongside all of those other factors that I showed you in the previous slide. It's part of the picture, a very important part of the picture, but only part of the picture nonetheless. So, just to close then, was this something we could ignore? No, I don't think so. It wasn't something we could do on our own. It was about supporting partnership goals that create a mutual benefit, not just for Cadbury, not just for the farmers, but for the other partners around the table as well. And finally, it was that principle of trying to create something and support something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and we see a long-term sustainable future for those small communities at the heart of our supply chain. Thank you.